Hello again, social psychology class. This is part 2 of the lecture on chapter 8, groups. Let me share my slides here for you. Okay, so first topic of part 2 is basically why do we prefer our membership in some groups over others? So this gets to what we call the initiation effect. Okay, so we like groups, we value them more if they have certain qualities. If they're prestigious, if they have high status, if they're small and elite, and if they contribute to our sense of self are some of the criteria. So this makes a lot of sense. We like to maintain our positive self-esteem. We want to be recognized and valued by other people. So for members of groups that are prestigious, that are high value in society, of course that reflects back on our self-esteem. But the initiation effect specifically is that we will also value groups more if they were difficult to get into. So we feel special if we have been invited to be in a small group. Not everybody gets to be in this group, so that means I must be really special. In addition to that, we will value a group more if we had to go through an actual initiation ritual to get into the group. Okay, so I'm going to talk about a study that tested this, but the idea is that this comes from a larger psychological phenomenon called optimal distinctiveness. So optimal distinctiveness is the idea that we have two different psychological needs that are kind of in opposition at any given time. One of those needs is to be recognized individually as unique, amazing, special people on the individual level. The other need is the social need, the idea that we want to be accepted as part of a group. We want to affiliate, we want to have family and friends and group status. So being in a group versus being an individual seem like they could be in opposition. Optimal distinctiveness is the idea that small elite groups will be ideal because we get both of these needs fulfilled simultaneously. We're in a group, but it's such a small group that we can still be recognized for our individual membership. A classic example of this for me is superhero groups like the Justice League of America if you are a DC fan, or the Avengers if you are a Marvel fan. So the idea is that it's certainly a small group, it's certainly elite. There is usually an initiation to get into the group. You usually have to like save the world in some way or the other to be accepted as an Avenger. So you're known as an Avenger once you're in the group, which is certainly very elite and high status, but each member of the group is still recognized for their individual contributions, for their individual powers, for their costume. They're still recognized as individuals. Okay, so back to the initiation effect. The idea is that if it's hard to get into a group, we're going to value it more. And this is partially because of something called effort justification. The idea is if we went through a lot of effort, if it was really difficult, if it cost a lot of money, if it took a lot of time, if we had to do some sort of ritualistic hazing to get into the group that potentially was even humiliating, we will then tell ourselves, wow, I must really value this group. Because if we don't really value the group, why did we do all of that effort to get into it? It makes us look kind of foolish. So this goes back to something we talked about earlier in the semester called cognitive dissonance. We tell ourselves this lie, I must really like this thing if I put all of that effort into it. So this is why hazing in the military and fraternities and sororities seems to actually increase loyalty to the group. There's a psychological reason why they put you through this, because after you get through it, you feel like, wow, I must have really valued this thing. So there's a classic study done way back in 1959 that tested the initiation effect with effort justification. And it's famous because it was the first study to show this effect and also because it was about sex. So we always want to hear about that. So Aronson and Mills did this study where they brought in female college students. And remember, this was in the 1950s, so the culture was a lot more kind of traditional back then, right? And so these women were told, we would like you to be a member of a sex discussion group. So that was really controversial at the time. It was like super progressive that they would be talking about sex in public. So they were told, that was the purpose of the study, to make sure that you're going to be comfortable in this sex discussion group. But it was secretly really about effort justification, right? So the independent variable was basically what did they have to do to get into the group? So they were all told, you're going to be part of this sex discussion group that's really controversial and very progressive, and it might make some people uncomfortable because we're going to be talking about these really sexy things. So a third of the participants were told, we just want to make sure that you're aware of the nature of the group. Does it sound like something you would want to do? And then they were told, okay, you got in. So that was actually the control condition where they had no initiation. The mild condition in the independent variable was that they had to read sort of vaguely suggestive passages from a book out loud. So that had words like prostitute and virgin. So it's not super embarrassing for the women. They just had to read a passage out loud from a book, but it was mildly embarrassing to the women because, again, this was in the 1950s. The severe initiation group basically made the women read porn out loud to a group of male experimenters. So they tried to make it as potentially embarrassing as possible. So that was the severe initiation group. Okay, so we have all three groups, a third of the participants in each. That's our independent variable. So then all the participants get through the initiation, depending on what group they're in. And then they're finally told, okay, you've gotten into the group, but we want to make sure that you know what to expect. So the first thing that you're going to do before you go to the live group is you're going to listen to a recording of last week's discussion. So listen to this recording and then tell us what you think. The recording was explicitly made to be super boring. So it wasn't actually even talking about human sex, it was talking about the sexual behaviors of insects like bees. So they listened to this recording that was purposely made to be really boring, and then they were asked, what did you think about the discussion? So the dependent variable is how much did you enjoy it? Did you find it exciting and interesting? So this should remind you of the cognitive dissonance study that we talked about before with Festinger with the purposely boring task, right? The turning of the knobs. So as you probably can expect now that you're halfway through social psychology, what we see in the results is that in the control group, people said, yeah, that was actually, kind of boring. They gave it an average of 80 out of 100. But the people who were in the severe initiation group said, oh my goodness, that was the most exciting discussion I've ever heard, and I'm so excited to be in this group. So they convinced themselves that the group was exciting because they had just gone through this embarrassing, humiliating ritual, and now they had to value it. Okay, our next topic is how groups influence our decisions. So the important part of the book that I want you to know is called group polarization. The idea of group polarization is that if you have an opinion about any issue and you go into a group where they're going to be discussing what should we do, the findings from social psychology are that the outcome of the group decision, the actual decision that the group comes to, will usually be more extreme in one direction or another than the attitudes of the people who were going into the group initially. So let's say that we had a decision, we have to decide what we're going to do on a scale of 0 to 100, okay? And the people going into the group are leaning toward like a 60 or a 70. The decision of the group will usually be like 80 or 90, even though the individual people weren't that extreme going into the group. And the reason that that happens is because during the actual discussion, people say, well, I'm kind of leaning in this direction. And everybody says, yeah, me too, I'm leaning in that direction too. And here's why I'm leaning, and here's why Bob is leaning, and here's why Jamal is leaning, here's why Lane is leaning in that direction. And so you get all of this kind of confirmation of your opinion. It's like a little echo chamber of your opinion, and you feel bolstered in your opinion, and you're hearing even more arguments for why this is a good idea. And so you get kind of jazzed up about it, and the decision kind of polarizes and becomes even more extreme than if the discussion had never happened. Because we kind of get competitive, yeah, I totally believe in this idea. And so the discussion kind of jazzes everybody up. The problem with this is that in our modern world, extreme decisions can often be problematic, right? We're kind of losing the ability to be moderates. And so this is kind of a problem for groups that kind of don't have someone who's arguing another opinion or a devil's advocate, and that sometimes we actually get better decisions if we have people who are kind of disagreeing with each other initially. So another problem that we've encountered in social psychology is called groupthink. which is when nobody disagrees with an opinion, the group discussion can sometimes lead to a really bad choice. And if you look at page 256 in the textbook, there's a whole list of examples of historical disasters that were caused by groups where no one disagreed with the decision, even though the decision was clearly pretty bad. So this happens when you have a group of people trying to make a decision where there's a leader whom everyone really likes and respects. And so if the leader suggests an idea that's maybe not a good idea, nobody really wants to publicly question the leader because it could be perceived as disloyal. If the group has high cohesiveness, if they all really like each other, again, people might be hesitant to speak out because they don't want to disrupt the positive group dynamic. And this is especially likely to happen if the group is under high stress, like they know that this decision is going to be internationally important, or there's a huge time pressure, like we have to make a decision in the next 1 minute or the space shuttle is going to explode, right? So if there's this pressure and if everybody likes each other and you don't want to be the one who's like going against the group, you usually just kind of don't express your opinion, and that can lead to really bad decisions. So one of the lessons from social psychology here is it's okay to disagree. It's okay to express your opinion. That usually leads to better decisions. You just have to do it in a respectful way. Okay, last two topics. One is brainstorming. So brainstorming is just the idea that a group is trying to come up with a creative solution to a problem. And you've probably heard of brainstorming before. Brainstorming can be a really effective technique. There are some rules. So one is to remind people of the main rule of brainstorming, which is that if we're going to be throwing out ideas, we're not evaluating the ideas at this first stage. We're just being as creative as possible, writing down every single idea. And then we'll evaluate them and narrow them down later. Another is that you have to take breaks. If you're sitting there for 8 hours, the ideas are not going to be very creative. Another is that you have people write down their ideas individually on a piece of paper first, and then you have them share. Because if you just say, okay, what ideas are there? Anybody in the group speak up. What happens is you get some social loafing, like we talked about in part 1 of the lecture. People will just kind of sit back and let other people do the work for them. And then finally, you want to include as many diverse views as possible. If you have all the same type of person coming up with an idea, you're only going to get one perspective. People who come from different backgrounds, who have different views, are going to lead to a more creative solution. Last topic, and my favorite in chapter 8, is brainwashing. So another term for brainwashing that you've probably heard is Stockholm Syndrome. So this actually came out of a real historical case where there were some hostages in Stockholm who basically developed feelings for their captors. So this is now a generic term for when hostages basically kind of come out of a hostage situation being on the side of the people who kidnapped them or held them hostage, or even sometimes falling in love with them. So there are a couple of famous historical examples of this. The most famous in history in the United States is Patty Hearst. So Patty Hearst actually was the daughter of a very rich man who owned a newspaper. He was very influential, and she ended up joining this left-wing terrorist group that was sort of anti-capitalist, and they robbed banks. So she was a member of this group for 19 months. She was seen robbing banks, and when she eventually was arrested by the police, she claimed that the group had kidnapped her, assaulted her, and brainwashed her. So she used this as her defense in her court trial. She was convicted of being guilty of bank robbery and terrorism. She was given a 35-year sentence, but President Jimmy Carter reduced her sentence to 7 years, and then Bill Clinton actually pardoned her. So it's a famous example of a woman claiming brainwashing in a court trial, and it's questionable. Different people believe her or not. Another interesting case is Yvonne Ridley. So she was a British reporter who wanted to sneak into Afghanistan to study the Taliban. So she did that. She snuck in. She disguised herself as a Muslim woman wearing a burqa, the full body covering that some Muslim women wear. and she was caught by the Taliban because she was trying to ride a donkey across a field wearing her burqa, and she fell off the donkey, and she had all of her camera equipment with her, and so they realized that she was a British reporter, and they basically kidnapped her. She was held by them for several weeks, and when she was released by them, she had converted to Islam and believed that the Taliban was a very positive organization. So what's interesting about this case is that she never claimed to be brainwashed. She actually legitimately is still Muslim today and is still in favor of the Taliban today, years later, about 20 years later. And she says, they didn't brainwash me. They treated me with respect. They taught me about the Muslim faith, and I genuinely converted. So she's an interesting case because people are not sure whether she was brainwashed or whether she genuinely just changed her mind. Fun fact, she is now living in Scotland, often speaks about the Muslim faith and is pro-Taliban. She's also very anti-Semitic. She says a lot of racist things about Jewish people, and she's on husband number 5. So she's an interesting lady. Okay, last thing is I have you just consider, just for fun, whether the character Belle from Beauty and the Beast is in fact a victim of the Stockholm Syndrome. Do you think it's reasonable to say that she was kidnapped by someone and eventually became someone who was in love with him? Is that an example of romance according to Disney, or is it in fact brainwashing? So I'll leave you with that. I hope you enjoyed chapter 8. Good luck on the quiz.